Friends, I bring you greetings on behalf of all New Democrats. As the leader of the New Democratic Party, I want you to know that we are allies in combating online hate. We have seen the rise in hate directed against various communities. We've seen anti-Asian hate. We know that anti-Black racism is very present. We know that hate against Indigenous people, against the LGBTQ community, against Muslims, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, they are all rising, they're all present in our society. And we know that online hate is used to radicalize, to inflame, and to incite hatred and violence against many communities. I've always said that hate is like a fire. Once it's allowed to take hold, it spreads, consuming everyone. And that's why we all have a responsibility to stand together against hate, to give it no space to take hold and no air to breathe. So New Democrats believe we need to tackle online hate with clear legislation that allows us to remove misinformation, divisive, or hateful messages wherever they are on social media platforms. Remove those immediately. We also need to use more resources to dismantle the groups that are spreading hateful messages, white supremacist groups and extreme right-wing groups that incite hatred, that radicalize people, and that are one of the causes of the increase in hate. Together, we can tackle online hate and build a more inclusive Canada and a more inclusive world. New Democrats, you can count on us as your allies to fight with you, to support you, and to fight for a more inclusive world.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Yusuf Siraj, and I'm here with you on the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. From the bottom of my heart,
good afternoon, everyone,
based on
and thank you
increased
for joining us
understanding
today.
of their
My name is
culture,
Yusuf Siraj,
their background, their
I'm here with
history,
you on
and their
the traditional
people, I want to
unceded
thank them
territory.
for taking care of this land and for passing it to us to help with them to build a beautiful and bright future for everyone. Today's event is one of incredible and extreme importance and highest urgency. We are here today to talk about supporting legislation to combat online hate. In Canada and around the world, we have seen such a rise in hate. It has reached disastrous levels, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. Minister Guilbeault, the Canadian Minister of Heritage, had prepared a message for us to start off today to address this issue. However, as is often the case with such nuanced and fast-changing challenges, we were requested to postpone sharing that video. Suffice it to say, both the minister and the federal government are committed to protecting Canadians and Canadians' well-being as their #1 priority. Today's forum will be shared with the government and all political parties in Canada in order to help inform and support the movement for online anti-hate legislation. Because online hate has offline consequences, it seems every day there is a new case of anti-Asian racism, anti-Black discrimination, anti-Indigenous hate, or attacks against other members of a BIPOC community. During COVID-19, the most dramatic outcome of this online activity was the January 6th, 2021 insurrection against the United States government. Online hate has been escalating for years. In 2017, at a mosque in Quebec City here in Canada, an attacker, a terrorist, killed 6 people and injured 5. It was widely reported that the social media platforms that he used, including 8kun, 8chan, as well as more traditional mainstream social media networks, helped him with the organization of his ideology and the propagation of this attack. Social media has been used to orchestrate genocide in countries such as Myanmar and religious persecution in countries in the subcontinent. In the 2019 Christchurch mosque attack, which resulted in the deaths of 51 people, including a 3-year-old child, and injuring over 40, the terrorist in that case was radicalized online. Bad actors may claim that efforts to remove online hate may stifle free expression. However, especially in today's world, they're taking a matter of life and death into their hands. Recently, President Biden was saying that people spreading anti-vaccination content online, of which 12 people were responsible for over 60%, is causing deaths. Social media companies have come under increased fire for not enforcing their own at-scale policies surrounding hate speech and leading to toxic and radicalizing outcomes. Removing hate speech online, or at least creating a context where it could be better regulated, will help to protect the free expression of rights of women, BIPOC members, LGBTQ plus persons, religious and racialized minorities, as well as prioritizing their right to be part of the conversation, not the right of transnational ideologues such as white supremacists. Policies across all social media platforms are inconsistent. They are sorely lacking and in need of regulation, resulting in hate spreading faster than ever before. We are hosting this forum today with our co-hosts at the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, the Chinese National Council for Social Justice, CCNCSJ, as well as the MOSAIC Institute, in order to educate, inform, and support our government, our leaders, our legislators in developing practical, real solutions and making Canada a leader in addressing online hate. Today's event is going to be a combination of both speakers and panelists. Our very first speaker, who I'm really happy to have here today, all the way from London, England, so thank you for staying up and joining us, Vidya, is Vidya Ramalingam, the founder of Moonshot. She is the founder and CEO, and Moonshot is an organization that uses technology to end online harms. They apply evidence and ethics and human rights to their mission. She led the European Union's first intergovernmental initiative on far-right terrorism and extremism, which was initiated by the governments of Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and the Netherlands. And she worked in partnership with the EU Commissioner for Home Affairs. Vidya regularly advises governments and tech companies on responding to online hate, terrorism, and violence. And she's an expert in the field of using data to better understand the online ecosystem. We're very grateful to have you here today with us, Vidya, and please, why don't you just start our event?
Thank you so much, Yusuf. I'm going to do my best now to share my screen. Let's just see if this works. Unfortunately, it's telling me that a host has disabled participant screen sharing. Is that something that we can easily fix?
Please try again.
Yusuf. Great, it's working now. Great, hopefully you're all seeing to join you all. As mentioned, my name is Vidya Ramalingam. I'm founder and CEO of Moonshot. And what I want to do today is just bring some evidence to the table around the scale of hate and engagement with hate content in Canada. We as an organization are an organization that works with governments and also with the tech companies, as well as with community organizations to respond to hate, to violent extremism, and other online harms. And we work internationally, not just in countries like Canada. We have a team of engineers, of data scientists, psychologists, mental health workers, and civil liberties experts. And what we do is we build technology to do two things. So one is to build the evidence base around the scale of online harms and violence and disinformation. But we also directly engage with audiences that are posting hate content online, that are interacting with hate content online. We work to ensure there are safer alternatives available to people that are consuming this content, but also try and intervene and try and pull people away from lives of hate and violence. And I should maybe start by saying here, I'm not a technologist by trade or by training. My background is really in the fight against white supremacy and hate and very much across the globe. About 12 years ago, I spent 2 years embedding myself essentially with a group of white nationalists as an anthropologist, really looking to understand what motivated people to join movements like that and ultimately to leave. And since then, I have dedicated my career to working to get people out of hate movements. And for me, technology and the online space gives us the power to reach people who are going down this path and to try and change their paths. Moonshot's been working to counter hate against communities online across Canada for the past 4 years. Before I dive into some of the data that we've gathered in partnership with various organizations across Canada and as well as with the Canadian government, I want to start by saying a few words about the unique moment that we're in, a moment of crisis in many ways. Hate actors and any extremists really thrive on moments of crisis. Their ideology is really premised on this notion that a race war is coming, and on what has been called by these movements accelerationism. That's one of the terms that's been used. It's this idea that white supremacists should try and increase civil civil disorder and contribute to the deliberate polarization and breakdown of society and breakdown of the political order. So oftentimes we see that crises are these moments where hate actors are grasping to take some of that fear and that anxiety in society and turn that into an opportunity for them to grow and for them to break down society as we know it. Now, we're in a unique moment in recent history. I mentioned a moment of crisis in many ways. We're facing multiple concurrent crises. The pandemic is just one of those, each compounding the other. And this has led to high levels of public anxiety and a clear opportunity for extremists to exploit, not just in Canada, but in many countries across the globe. Now, when the pandemic began last spring, we were running a project in partnership with Public Safety Canada to understand the scale and spread of attempts to access far-right hate content across the nation. We tracked a 19% increase in attempts to access far-right hate content in Canada's 6 largest cities, and you can see the cities that we were tracking this in here. Like many Canadians, individuals that were engaging with hate content were doing this more so under lockdown, under stay-at-home measures during the pandemic. We found in particular average weekly searches for specific types of violent far-right content, so in particular for radio and podcasts, increased by 330% and increased by 324% for violent hate-based video games, so attempts to access these sorts of video games on search engines. This was all during the period that we studied. So as I mentioned, just as we are all online more as a result of the pandemic, so are hate actors. And this has positioned us in a very delicate moment. Throughout this year, we've been in a state of heightened extremist activity online. And what the tech companies are doing to respond is simply not enough. Removal of content is hugely important to create safer online spaces that are less likely to be abused by far-right extremists and hate actors. However, content removal won't stem far-right violence on its own, and this is for 3 reasons. The first is the large majority of hate content, as according to the terms of service of policies of many of the tech companies today, the large majority of that hate content remains ineligible for takedowns. And this is according to the terms and service and policies of the tech companies, both large and small. Oftentimes, groups that are posting this content walk the line to keep their content online, and they do that incredibly well. But secondly, when this content is removed, when hate content is removed, importantly, the post, the video, or the account is deleted, but not the individual who posted it. That person still exists and may either continue to repost online or may move to another platform or may be deeply vulnerable and pose a threat to the community around them. And the third reason why moderation is not enough on its own is that there are still many spaces on the internet which are just not even liable for takedowns at all, and where this content can thrive. And I'm going to give you one example. This was a search that was entered into Google by an individual the day after the Christchurch attack in March 2019, which left 51 people dead. Brenton Tarrant is the name of the perpetrator, and this same search was replicated across the globe, not only in New Zealand itself, but across dozens of countries, numerous languages, and across search engines. Moments like this are not liable for takedown. A Google search can't be removed or blocked. And more often than not, when you search for violent extremist content on Google, it presents in the top search results. So we need not only better regulatory frameworks to ensure that hate content is removed, but also longer-term proactive solutions to really stem hate and violent extremism online and offline. Now, what does our data tell us about extremism in Canada online, and specifically hate speech? Over the course of a year, so this is from March 2019 to March last year, we monitored attempts to access hate speech and far-right extremism via search engines. And this is across the entire country. We found high volumes of this search traffic per capita, specifically in British Columbia, in Ontario, and in Alberta, with the greatest proportion of hate being directed towards Muslim, Jewish, and Black Canadian communities. We also found that Canadians aged 25 to 34 were the most likely to search for this far-right extremist content online, and specifically far-right conspiracies about immigration and about Jewish elites dominated the search traffic. We also detected significant volumes of high-risk searches, so specifically searches where users typed into a search engine, "I want to kill," followed by the name of a particular ethnic group. There was in particular, and I mentioned the Christchurch shooting earlier, there was in particular across Canada widespread interest in an anti-Muslim song that had been played by the Christchurch shooter, which advocates for the murder of Muslims and is often circulated by far-right groups online. And because we build longitudinal data sets and because we monitor engagement with extremist content around real-world events, we have time and time again seen a similar trend play out. And this is the case across the globe and also in Canada. When violence takes place offline, it tends to escalate engagement with hate online. So for example, after the horrific killing of a Muslim Canadian family last month, we found the same song that I just mentioned, the song that was played by the Christchurch perpetrator, that anti-Muslim song, we found that that same song was being shared in violent extremist forums online amongst Canadian audiences, specifically in extremist groups affiliated with Canada. Hate actors have also deliberately adapted their narratives and they propagate conspiracy theories based on current affairs. And I'm going to move on to another slide, but just so you know what you're looking at here, this is a breakdown by province and territory of attempts to access violent far-right search traffic across Canada over the course of a year. So I mentioned that these hate actors are very deliberately creating conspiracy theory narratives that build on hot button issues that they know that the general public are going to have strong feelings about. We tend to see a clear cycle in the distribution of conspiracy theories, especially those that are targeting certain communities. We tend to see these sorts of disinformation efforts are seated on fringe platforms like 8kun and 4chan, where there's very little to no moderation. And by design, we see these actors pushing these narratives, deliberately selecting conspiracy theory narratives that reflect the news media cycle, that deliberately attract attention. And they craft narratives which position some groups as inherently evil and others as good. So it's very much based around black and white thinking and pitting communities against one another. And then there's oftentimes an effort to deliberately push these narratives into the mainstream. We then tend to see, as mainstream media begins to pick up on some stories related to these narratives, the tech companies might then crack down. And then once again, the actors that are pushing these narratives get pushed back onto the fringe platforms. By this time, it's too late. The narratives that have been pushed out by these groups have already done their damage. And sometimes even we see those narratives spilling over into real world violence. So how can we combat online hate speech, online incitement to violence, and the disinformation that tends to underpin some of these narratives online? Well, there's some work that needs to be done, as mentioned, to promote better moderation on tech platforms. And that includes the enforcement of anti-harassment policies on major platforms. And we obviously need to be engaging in proactive and targeted deplatforming of content that promotes incitement against certain communities. There also have to be some interventions that are delivered directly with those who are engaging hate content online. So again, this has to go just beyond moderation as well. The key to intervening online is to distinguish as much as possible between different types of actors and different types of threats that we're dealing with. Now, there are genuinely some individuals in Canada that are inciting violence and hate against people of color, and the Canadian legal system needs to be equipped to handle those cases. My firm belief is that anyone below that threshold who might just be encountering this content online, engaging with it, is someone who I want to try and change. Now, as mentioned, most of my career has been dedicated to the delivery of social work methods to pull people out of hate groups and specifically white supremacy. So my work has always been based on the fundamental belief that change is possible, even for those that we think might be too far gone. And over the years, I've worked with dozens of individuals who have left white supremacist and hate movements. And you'll hear later in this session from my dear friend, Tony Mcaleer, based in Canada, who set up an organization entirely set up by former neo-Nazis who are now anti-racist activists and who help others leave these ideologies behind. Now, the internet presents great opportunity to interact with people who might be going down this path and to try and plant the seeds for that change, to connect them in with organizations that can do that work with them. So for the hardened ideologues, for people that are supporting hate groups and maybe even buying into white nationalist ideologies, they require these targeted intervention efforts. And there are some great organizations working across Canada to deliver social work interventions with these kind of people. So it'll be really critical that we connect people online, audiences that are engaging with hate online, with these kinds of programs offline. But then going further down the spectrum, there's wider portions of the Canadian public, it might even be people that you and I know, who might be coming into contact with disinformation or conspiracy theories targeting specific communities. For those audiences, the intervention online needs to look really different. What we need to be doing is building more critical media consumption skills, educating and challenging misperceptions, which can underpin hate, and offering information which specifically dismantles some of the disinformation efforts that have been pushed against minority communities. But first and foremost, anything that we do online obviously needs to be coupled with strong and clear messaging from political leadership that hate and disinformation and incitement to violence targeting these communities is unacceptable. And the importance of hearing this from political leadership can't be emphasized enough. Anything we do online really has the potential to be unraveled if there are conflicting messages coming from our leaders. So just a final few points to end here. We at Moonshot are really proud to add our voice to this forum and to call for greater safeguards against online hate speech in Canada. Each of us plays a role in helping to end these kinds of online harms and the real world violence that they produce. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you today. I will stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you very much, Vidya. Again, the work you're doing is amazing. It's awesome. It's so needed. We have an anecdote to share that we were walking through, my colleague Tarek, who's on this call, we were walking through the VPD offices and they had your reports on their desk. And I was like, hey, I know those. So the impact is there. People are engaged with the information. And again, there's so much that we need to educate the public, educate our leaders, educate our communities on. And we appreciate your incredible contribution to that field. Thank you so much, Vidya. Our next session will now transition into the panel portion of our event. Our first panel is about lived experience and what it's like to be a victim of online hate. Our panel moderator is Rachel Mansell. She's the Vice President of Operations at the MOSAIC Institute. At the MOSAIC Institute, they believe that everyone has the right to be free from prejudice and discrimination, and they support that belief by equipping people with the tools to dismantle prejudice in their own communities, whether through research, dialogue, policy, or training. Rachel completed her education at Western University and her master's at the University of Toronto. Since inaugurating MOSAIC's Master of Global Affairs internship in 2012, Rachel has held a number of positions at the institution, rising up to become the Vice President of Operations. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us. You'll be the first panel moderator, and I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Yusuf, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening on this really important topic. You know, as a Canadian institution, we usually begin with an acknowledgement of the Indigenous land on which we gather together, and these acknowledgements are a really important part of our ongoing commitment to unlearn, build relationship with Indigenous peoples, and just create networks of understanding. But you know, this is a virtual event, and we're all distributed across the world, different parts of Canada, including countries that have entirely different histories of settlement and development. So therefore, you know, at MOSAIC, we just encourage everyone to look up the Indigenous heritage of your local community, wherever you might be, and reflect on those relationships between the First Peoples of your area through to everyone that now calls that place home. Our office is located in Takaranto or Toronto, and it's located on the ancestral and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Mississauga of the New Credit. MOSAIC's team, though, is also distributed across this land of what we now know as Canada. And we, together as a team, celebrate the ancestral and traditional lands of the Algonquin, Anishinaabe, Attawandaron, Blackfoot, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Lenape, and Mississauga of the New Credit peoples. I've been working on my pronunciation, so I hope everyone can bear with me as I work through them. I myself am joining you today from London, Ontario, which is a traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenape peoples that have long-standing relationships with the land, water, and region of southwestern Ontario. The local First Nations communities of this area include the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, the Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation. Additionally, there's a growing urban Indigenous population who make the city of London home. We all know that online hate is a problem. That's why we're all here today. That's why we're here supporting this event. And the numbers are staggering, as we just heard from Vidya. Last year, MOSAIC conducted research in Ontario about personal experiences with online hate. And we found that 92% of the people that we surveyed felt uncomfortable because of something negative that they experienced online about their race or ethnic origin. 76% had witnessed online hate speech towards Black, Indigenous, Jewish, and Muslim communities. People generally agreed that social media posts promoting physical violence against certain communities are increasing. And 1 in 5 of the people that we surveyed sought mental health support for harmful and hateful content that they experienced via the internet. But these are stats. And through this panel, we really wanted to share the real impacts of online hate through personal stories. And I'm so grateful to be joined here today by Issa and Naima. Thank you both so much for being willing to share your experiences with online hate to help our audience understand the real impact that it has on everyday lives. So I'm just going to introduce our 2 panelists briefly, and then we're going to get into our conversation. Issa is an Anishinaabe Two-Spirit comedian and producer whose roots lay in Couchiching First Nation, Ontario. They use comedy as a tool in dealing with racism, homophobia, and sexism. They are the co-founder and producer of Woke Comedy Hour, voted the #1 comedian in the 2019 and 2020 United Top 30. They are a member of the newly founded BIPOC art collective, Take Home, which is located in Artspace. Naima is a Somali refugee to Canada who is an educator, teacher, and anti-racism researcher. She has a master's degree in education from Otterbein University. Naima is passionate about education, advocacy, youth empowerment, and facilitating allyship to address systemic issues. In 2021, she became the president of the Somali Canadian Centre of BC. Thank you both for joining us today. So I'm going to do my best to facilitate a conversation among the 3 of us. I'm going to start off by asking you both some questions. Feel free to answer and also to converse with each other as well, and I'll jump in from time to time as well. So my first question is really just to help our audience understand these experiences. So what does online hate look and feel like to you? And can you give us some examples of things you've experienced or seen and heard?
Sure. I think online hate looks like a whole lot of ignorance. So people who aren't educated in ways of, in my experience and what I experience as an Indigenous person, is anti-Indigenous hate. So a lot of the online hate that I experience is, people coming up with stereotypes. So people saying, you're an alcoholic, you shouldn't have children, you get everything for free, your people should have been eradicated, residential schools was a good thing. And then recently, with the unearthing of children's bodies being found at residential schools across Turtle Island, people saying that, that's not murder, that's just solving a problem. So that's really just a small portion of some of the online hate that I experience. Just because I'm a vocal person, I'm an activist, and I do promote a lot of anti-racist work, and that's, that comes with the territory, unfortunately. But I think, as a First Nation person, I am, working to change that.
Okay, I think I unmuted myself. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Thank you. To me, online hate can look like spreading or inciting hate against individual or group based on perceived negative characteristics. If left unaddressed, it can lead to acts of violence and hate crimes. It can feel like an atmosphere of hostility where boundaries between online and offline are blurred, and where there's little individual accountability. Sadly, hate speak and trolling became more common online, and people feel like they can say whatever they want because there's no consequence to their hate speech. Some of the experiences that I've had is from outside of my social media. So like my pages are private, but when I interact with a public page, and because my profile shows me wearing a hijab, some may label me as a terrorist, belonging to like a religion that promotes violence. I've been labeled as oppressed. Hey, you know, you're in Canada or you're in America, you don't need to wear the hijab, just take it off. So regardless of whatever comment I made, and it had nothing to do with religion or me being in a country that I was trying to be in, but basically they just see my profile and then like, you know, tag my name because I was commenting on that and just be like, hey, by the way, you know, you're here, like you're in the West now, you're in Canada, you don't need to wear that scarf. And then luckily, you know, some people do defend me. It's not your business, you know, stay out of our business or stuff like that to the person that makes that comment. But then there are a large of people who go with whatever that first comment was, and you know, continue attacking me. So like forced to wear the hijab, or you know, like your religion promotes violence. Why is that? You know, like as if I have the answer. But so those were some of the things that I've experienced when I interact with public pages, when I comment.
Thank you, both of you, for sharing some examples. You know, I think those examples really demonstrate the difference between online hate and what that means, you know, why legislation is needed, why this event is needed. Because I think sometimes the word hate in a way almost can be desensitizing to some people. We use hate colloquially all the time, you know, I hate this food, I hate this color, I hate the weather, right? But when we hear the types of experiences and the comments and the awful words that you both experience regularly, it really puts into perspective what online hate feels like and how harmful it is. Now, something that both of you mentioned are the offline consequences to online hate, that there's not this boundary. It doesn't just stay in a screen, as horrible and as awful as that is. Can you share a little bit about what those offline consequences are?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it looks very, very similar as to what I mentioned, you know, what I experience online, except it's in my face. So, you know, I'll be minding my own business and, you know, I'll get these hateful comments about, you know, being on welfare. Like I get called a welfare bum quite a bit. You know, just things like that, you know, people just thinking that it's their business to comment. I get a lot of, like if I go grocery shopping or, you know, just walk into a store in general, I do get followed around, which, you know, sometimes for me, the way I deal with it is, you know, like I'll address those people who follow me around and, you know, be like, if you're gonna follow me, at least hold my basket type of thing. Just because I'm raising 2 children, and one thing that I find really important in dealing with racism is showing them how to deal with racism and how to not let it defeat you, because sometimes it can feel, it can make you feel so powerless, and it can, you know, it can take away just your humanity. And so, you know, a lot of Canadian parents don't realize that, you know, don't realize that there's an extra step to being, whether that's Indigenous or, you know, whether that's being Black, Muslim, you know, just being BIPOC as a parent. there's so many other extra steps that we have to take as parents when dealing with hate, like face to face. You know, sometimes because I support a lot of Indigenous clothing designers, I'll wear clothing proudly. And, you know, one time I had a guy threaten to kill me and, you know, call me a racist slur. I was walking with my best friend, and it was the first time I had left my house during the pandemic. And I went for a walk with my friend, and a guy just randomly called me a racial slur and said, you know, I'm going to kill you. I am also disabled, so it wasn't like, you know, I could just run. So these are the types of things that, you know, that I face as an Indigenous person living in Winnipeg, which is one of the most racist cities in Canada. And so, yeah, my life looks a little bit different than, you know, than Canadians who lack melanin, essentially.
The consequences obviously can lead to anxiety, depression, a lot what she mentioned just right now, can even lead to offline harassment because sometimes the targeted individual's address might be published, right? So online hate can create unsafe spaces where a culture of intolerance and violence is promoted, and where groups of people can come together to promote that violence and discriminatory ideologies. So the consequences are there. It's not like sometimes I do kind of think of it as like, hey, don't take it personal. You don't know these people personally. It's easy to think that way, but when you do read what they say about you, kind of like you feel bad, right? Because words are hurtful. So there are consequences, and if someone is not emotionally resilient, it gives them a lot of problems, right? Anxiety, like I said, and depression, and I'm sure there are other things that have been reported due to online hate.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think something that you both brought up is that those extra steps, you know, you have to teach yourself to be resilient. You have to teach your kids how to respond. You have to think through yourself, you know, put on that armor when you go somewhere. Those are things that not everyone has to deal with. And hearing these stories, I think, is really important, as painful as it is. And, you know, I'm in this space, I do this work, and it's painful to hear these experiences that you have on a regular basis. But at the same time, it reinforces that these are real experiences. And, you know, sometimes I think it can be too easy for people to hear some of these stories and dismiss them as an outlier. Oh, that just happened to this person. That doesn't really happen to everyone. It's just an isolated incident. Or they maybe think it's not that bad. What would you say to people that maybe don't quite understand that this is a widespread issue and not just an individual experience?
Watch TV, you know, look on any news article comment section. It is rife with people unhinged with hate and ignorance. You know, look at our laws, our laws that, you know, don't always take BIPOC people's safety and humanity, you know, into consideration. I also, you know, like looking online and seeing hate groups that are dedicated to hating specific individuals, specific cultures, specific groups of people. I know that as somebody who produces comedy shows, which you would think, how could hate pop up, you know, during a fun comedy show? No, it does come in, and you know, we have comedians all BIPOC comedians who do our shows and who receive hate and backlash, you know, just for existing, just for telling their stories, you know, as a way of taking back their power. And so, yeah, it's really not hard to see. It's not an isolated incident. When we have these things in our faces, you know, children's bodies are being exhumed, families are being plowed for walking and existing. You know, people are going into places of worship and committing acts of violence. These aren't isolated incidences. These are things that you know, are becoming a regular part of our life. So I think for people who, you know, think like, oh, it's getting better, you know, there's improvements, we have so much further to go. And it's, you know, something that we can't, you know, stop and take a break. So that's what I would say.
I would say exactly what she said, and also just to educate these individuals as well. Invite them to programs such as this, where people are sharing their lived experiences, so that way, just because it's not happening to them doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? Maybe they're not around people who have faced online hate and belittle the situation, but if they are around people who are going through these lived experiences, they might have a different perspective on how they feel about it.
Absolutely, you know, that interpersonal interaction is a core part of what we do at MOSAIC to try and help mitigate these issues. And I know both of you are very active in anti-racism and anti-hate activities as well. And, you know, even with everything that you just shared about what you experienced, you still find the strength to actively work against online hate and offline hate. So I'm wondering if you could both share a little bit more about the work that you do as well, and how your experiences maybe inform the work that you do.
Sure. As I mentioned, I am a co-producer and co-founder of Vote Comedy Hour, which is a comedy platform where we feature the voices of BIPOC comedians. And so a lot of our comedians, we have Indigenous comedians, we have refugee comedians, Newcomer comedians, BIPOC across the board. And so, you know, that's one way that we deal with hate, is we take our experiences, we take those times that people try to take away our humanity, and we present it in a funny manner. And you know, that's can be really angering and triggering for a lot of racist folks, you know, realizing that the hate that they gave to us and that they, you know, shot at us, that we're taking it and we're using it as, you know, as our Patronus, you know, we're using it to our advantage. And this is how I make a living, is I take all of these experiences and moments of hate and I make fun of it. And that's how, you know, this is how I provide for my children. And it can be really bothersome for racists. Another way is I work with youth, and I work with youth in ways of education. And so one of the projects that I used to be involved with was working with Newcomer youth and Indigenous youth, and having them realize how similar their experiences are in Canada, and how you know, you have Indigenous youth who are coming from isolated communities, and, you know, having that culture shock, and a lot of them experiencing racism for the first time when they're coming to urban settings. And then, you know, with Newcomer youth, the same experience. And that's, you know, that's something that was a unique project, and lost funding for it. And so that no longer exists. And I think that's kind of the nature of the beast with this type of work, is that, you know, the government doesn't see the racism problem solved, and so, you know, it doesn't work, so your project is scrapped. And so for me, as a community member, as an anti-racist parent, I often will do a lot of that work voluntarily. So, you know, like I'll go into schools, I'll work with youth groups, just to talk about anti-racism and what that means, especially, you know, when we're living on Turtle Island, and you know, how can we coexist and cohabitate without all the hate.
Rachel, can you please just repeat the question again for me?
Absolutely. So I was just commenting that both of you had mentioned that education or lack of education is part of the reason why we see all of these types of issues. And I know that you, Naima, work in this area of anti-racism and anti-hate. And even with all of the things that you experience, you are still continuing to do this work. Can you share a little bit about the work that you do and how your experiences inform the work that you do?
Okay, so I'm currently working with youth. It's like creating a safe space where they can share their lived experiences, judgment-free zone. A lot of them can relate to each other, just kind of creating that dialogue that, hey, it's not just you that's going through it, and there are others that went through this, and this is the way they coped with it, you know, kind of help each other with our coping mechanisms and build our emotional and resiliency. So with education, obviously, it will reach many of the youth that feel like this is something that they're going through, but nobody really understands them. You know, just kind of facilitating and helping them realize that there were others, like even myself, I've been there and I still go through it. It's not a problem that's going to disappear tomorrow. So let's find a common ground where we can work together and find a way to live a comfortable life, with you being Black or Arab or from Indigenous group. Find a way that you can, you know, contribute to society positively, regardless of the impact that you're going through.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit more about what you do. And I think, you know, we are obviously all aligned in the idea that hearing each other's stories and is a way to build coping mechanisms, build that resiliency, build awareness. So it's really wonderful to be around people that are all aligned with that idea. And I know the others who are going to be speaking later today feel the same way. I know we are just about out of time for our panel. So for my last question for both of you, I just wanted to know, what is one thing that you wish people better understood about online hate and its impacts?
I wish people understood that sometimes we don't want to be resilient. Sometimes we just want to exist without, you know, having to think about what emotional impact will going on the internet today have on me. You know, like, can I get onto the internet and just look at videos of cute kittens and, you know, funny fails without having an experience of hate online? So, you know, I really wish that people knew, and sometimes that online hate isn't intentional, it's ignorance. And, you know, people don't know that what they're doing is hateful and degrading. So that's what I wish. I wish people were more mindful so that we don't have to be resilient 24/7.
I agree. I do wish that they were not as hateful as they come, and that we're just like people like them. you know? So just because someone's skin color is different than yours doesn't mean that they deserve to be mistreated or be hated on because of their skin color or religion or any different views that they have from you. We just need to learn how to accept each other. I mean, we live in a diverse country, so let's put that into application and use the diversity that we have and treat each other with kindness.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Issa and Naima, for your words today, for sharing your stories. I know it's hard and it's painful, and it's truly appreciated. And I know throughout the rest of the event today, we're going to be hearing more about how to take some of the practical steps to see your wishes come true. So thank you again, and I will turn it back over to Yusuf.
Thank you so much. Again, guys, what we heard today, it is the reality for millions of people. The experiences that Issa and Naima shared today are not just stories, but they're the lives of our neighbors, our friends, and even our family members who are BIPOC, which is an acronym for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. In 2021, for instance, we saw a dramatic increase in anti-Asian hate, crimes and assaults against Asian women, men, and children, as well as elders. In Canada, there was a 717% increase in hate crimes targeting the Asian community members in Vancouver. A Bloomberg research report found that Vancouver had become the anti-Asian hate capital of the world. The Atlanta city shootings in the United States on March 16th, which saw 6 Asian women killed by a white gunman. There was multiple reasons for that, but he targeted Asian women. Was a culmination of years of rising anti-Asian rhetoric, discriminatory practices, stereotypes, and dehumanization, particularly online during the COVID-19 pandemic. The stereotypes and the memes and the insults contribute to an ecosystem where people feel that they can attack people who, in their eyes, have become dehumanized. Over the last few months, there has been a shocking spate of attacks against visibly Muslim women, most of whom were Black, in Alberta. Over 20 people were attacked. Many of them had their headscarves pulled off. They were insulted, threatened, physically assaulted, and shot at just because they were who they were. Some were walking down the street. Some were walking with their friends in a park. Some were even just sitting in the car, and they were pulled out and attacked. In London, Ontario, we saw a terrorist deliberately ramming his pickup truck into a visibly Muslim Pakistani Canadian family at an intersection as the family was out for a walk. He murdered 3 generations of one family in one instant with that action. The medium by which many of these people's worldview is being shaped, their minds being infected with the virus, is the online format. It is not just fun and games. It is in many instances the real world nowadays. And just what happens in real life when we walk outside, we're governed by laws to protect society, to protect each other. As we can see, there is a need here for legislation to protect ourselves online. Our next speaker, Mohammed Hashem, is the Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Federation. Mohammed is, he's a founding advisor as well of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, and he also sits on the Board of Trustees of the United Way of Greater Toronto. Now, the purpose of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation is to facilitate throughout Canada the development, sharing, and application of knowledge and expertise in order to contribute to the elimination of racism and all forms of racial discrimination in our society. Thank you so much for joining us, Mohammed. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. First, I want to just acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, which is also here in Mississauga, Ontario. I've had a lot of difficult conversations over the last number of days and weeks with people, particularly from the Muslim community. I've been involved with activism in this community for a very long time, and it's just been one thing after the next. I think when we see violence so frequently, it makes you feel targeted, just consistently targeted. I know I've spoken to seniors, I've spoken to family members who are honestly for the first time in many years contemplating whether they do take off their hijab, whether they do not go out for a walk outside, whether they as seniors leave their homes, because that sense of fear is just getting exacerbated again and again and again by all these different events that are happening. And part of it is a bit difficult to explain. You know, when, to be frank, when Trump was around, there was always a sense of, well, there's somebody that's pointing the finger towards us. Or when other politicians of the past were around and using their microphones and their platforms to point towards Muslim communities, there was a sense that there is a reason why this is coming towards us in particular. But now, for the most part, and obviously there's glaring examples that will counter this, but for the most part, federally at least, you don't see any discussion about whether or not Islamophobia exists or doesn't exist. For the most part, politicians agree that there is a bit of a consensus around Islamophobia, that it exists, that it's wrong, and that it needs to be tackled with. So if it's not coming from, if it's not, maybe that inspiration for that violence may not be coming from political voices. If it's not coming from political voices, where is it coming from? Is it just, has Islamophobia seeped in? Is it just that the violence towards Muslims is just now becoming so much more frequent because this is the last gasp of air of the political movements that were inspired previously and are now on their last gasp of air? Or is it that the sense of dehumanization of Muslims has just gone so deep that it's just there, and that this is just now gonna escalate? Is it going up? Is it going down? And I think there's not an honest answer to that. And I don't know what it is that is particularly driving it in this current moment. Obviously, COVID has had a different, has had numerous impacts on different on people in very different ways. Is it that contributing towards it? It's very difficult to say. But the one thing that has been consistently true over the last years is just that the environment around information has just consistently been getting worse and worse and worse. And the reason why I point to that is because, when the internet was created, and for some of us who remember when the internet was created, it was seen as a place of freedom where anything could be said, anything could go, that ideas will free flowly, and therefore it is a space of ultimate freedom. So the expectation of the internet being that place has existed and has allowed people to walk around and say and do things that would never be allowed in society. You can't walk up to somebody in your town square and say the most horrific things like people do online. Like first and foremost, like people would just not tolerate that. But also, there's an anonymity that exists online that allows you to say those things without having to deal with the repercussions of it. And what I know now more so than ever before is that this environment is problematic. It's deeply problematic because there's no checks and balances, because there's no ability to curtail it in a way that has some semblance of sensibility towards each other or decency towards each other, that ensures that an environment is protected to provide for people to equally access it, enjoy it, and be able to use it. it's just letting too much hate fester and foster. And it's happening again and again and again. And maybe what we're just seeing now is just the most violent expressions of what we've seen the environment change to be. And maybe that what's happening, the targeting of Canadian Muslims that we've seen recently and particularly, is just chickens coming home to roost. This, maybe we left that environment too open, and now this is what we're having to deal with. So I'm encouraged by the conversation today. I wish I had the courage that Isa had in terms of being able to make fun of him versus versus absorbing the pain and the trauma, because that is an act of courage, and I commend them for it. But it's difficult. And I would also just say one last thing. What we're seeing now is not happening in isolation. Black communities have faced oppression for many years, centuries, and it's just people the same as well here in North America, or on Turtle Island particularly. But I think that what's really important is that we need to be able to identify how this actually is manifested. And I'll give you a quick example. In London, Ontario, when you saw the person drive and mow over 4 people, 2 days later, there was a vigil held. Every single politician from literally every single level that represented that area came and spoke there. But in Brossard, Quebec, there was an Asian woman who was 53 years old and an Asian man who was 50 years old, who were run over once on one street, a couple of streets over, and then the man was run over. 2 people were run over by the same person in the same incident in 2 different streets, and the community felt like this was targeted, because maybe it felt that way, but the police never called it a hate crime. The police never said that it was that it could have been hate motivated at all. They just called it a hit and run, and that was it. And the impact of that was huge on the community, because they were never able to hear the words that it was hate motivated, or gave them any sense of safety because of what they looked like. They knew that there was a potential that they were being targeted, but that was never voiced or heard, nor was their pain recognized. No politician came and spoke there, nor was there any political reaction towards it. It was just, it happened, people felt that pain, and they were asked to basically move on. And I think that's an important thing to remember, because recognizing people's pain, particularly because of hate, is an important way for them to heal and move to the next step. And sometimes that happens and sometimes that doesn't happen in communities. But I think it's important for us to recognize, because many of us over here probably never even heard of what happened in Brossard, but it did. And I think it's important to make sure that we stay connected to each other. And I appreciate the organizers bringing us all together to talk about this, to understand each other's perspectives. And I hope to contribute in this conversation as we go forward. Thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to continuing to support the work that's happening amongst all of you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. And again, appreciations to you and your organization for your support in co-organizing and promoting this event as well. It's such an important topic that no one organization can do it. We have to work as allies in bringing forward practical solutions to solve this real issue that is, as we've heard throughout this event, it's affecting and ending lives. Our next panel is actually going to be talking about the the weaponization of social media and the spreading of online hate, the in-depth mechanisms and ideologies by which this is happening. Our moderator for this panel is my friend and colleague, Tarek Tayeb. Tarek is a co-founder of the Islam Unraveled Anti-Racism Initiative, as well as Foundation for a Path Forward, which is the official faith-based community convener for the province of British Columbia. He has been working for community empowerment and well-being for over 20 years, and he is a co-founder and director of the Muslim Food Bank and Community Services, as well as a vice president with the BC Muslim Association. Thank you very much. Tarek, it's all yours.
Thank you, Yusuf. I see some friends that have also joined, Constable Shiraz Hadif from the Metro Vancouver Transit Police and Anthony Statham from the RCMP Hate Crimes. And I just wanted to quickly share my journey. So in 2017, the Quebec shootings happened, and the unthinkable, somebody would come into a mosque and shoot people in the back. And that's how I met the hate crimes team and transit police, was when it was a convening of Muslim leaders in British Columbia as to how can we communicate with the Muslim community as to report incidents and biases, however minor they may be. Where there's smoke, there's fire. We need to be able to have the Muslim community feel comfortable to report that. So the idea was, why don't we go to the Friday Jummah prayer, which is the day of the week that Muslims congregate in the largest number, to meet the Muslim community with law enforcement and to get folks to be encouraged to report hate crimes. So naively, with Anthony and Constable Hanif and others, I asked, why is this happening? Why would somebody do that? Why would somebody go into a mosque and shoot people in the back? Where is this stuff coming from? And I think it was Gareth Blount, one of the officers, he said, there's a lot of online hate being spread against racialized minorities like Muslims. I was like, so that's motivating people to do this. So in our work and this particular panel, the weaponization of social media, that social media has turned into a weapon. So the disinformation and lies about Black people, Muslims, Asian people, First Nations have become so prevalent that it is mobilizing people in a very terrible way to create acts of violence, verbal and physical, and even murder. So this forum, we have two esteemed guests that I consider friends, and I very much respect their work. And I'll introduce our first panelist. Her name is Dr. Heidi Byridge, and she's the co-founder and CEO at the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. She's the former director of the Intelligence Project, the Southern Poverty Law Center. The Southern Poverty Law Center is the catalyst for racial justice in the South and beyond, working in partnerships with communities to dismantle white supremacy, strengthen intersectional movements, and advance the human rights of all people. And also how white supremacy is now a transnational threat to immigrant and Muslim populations in multiple countries, and what needs to be done to combat it. And the next panelist is also a very good friend, Tony Mcaleer, who's a former neo-Nazi and founder of Cure for Hate, speaking about white supremacist psychology, ideology, and impact today. He's also the co-founder and formerly of Life After Hate. Life After Hate is committed to helping people leave the violent far right to connect with humanity and lead compassionate lives. Once deeply involved in the white Aryan resistance, Tony Mcaleer is at the forefront of a group reaching out to turn fascists around from hate. So on that note, I'll start with a question for Tony. And Tony, the psychology, because a lot of times, again, like I naively asked years ago, where is this all coming from? And as you were a leader in our hometown of Vancouver in the white supremacist neo-Nazi sphere, in those days, what was the psychology? What are the prevalent psychologies like generation identity or the great replacement theory that are motivating large groups of people to start to advocate for violence and murder against minorities?
That's a great question, and it's a deep question, and it's there's a portion of it which is internalized. I think behind the dehumanization of the others is a self-dehumanization that's projected onto others. And I think it's important to recognize that. There's also another level, there's anger and fear. The great replacement theory, all of these theories, all about fear. And it's all about fear of loss, fear of replacement via population. And the anger and fear behind that is based on a misplaced sense of entitlement that mostly white men and women have been nurtured with for a very long time. So to understand where that anger and fear come from, you have to understand the entitlement on which the fear of loss is based. So there's two angles. There's the external portion to it, and then there's the external portion, the projection onto others. And social media. I was around when the internet first came in as a white supremacist organizer and built one of the very first white supremacist websites for resistance records in 1995. And back then it was the Wild West. It did represent freedom to say whatever you wanted, but the ability to communicate, while it was a huge step forward, really didn't take off until social media came around. And that really multiplied the ability for people to communicate with each other and to form groups, for better or for worse. I mean, there's so many great things that have come out of social media and our ability to connect, and particularly as we've sat in this period of extended isolation. I'd hate to imagine what we would have been like without the internet through this period. But it's allowed for a host of malicious actors to really work with it in a malevolent way. And the challenge with it is it feeds a self-reinforcing hatred of reinforcing pattern of and belief system of hatred and dehumanization. And the way the memes are shared, the way everything is always trying to outdo the last joke, the last meme, the last act of terror, the last massacre. And it's almost as if that this behavior of hatred, and I want to talk about hatred. I want to distinguish it from people that are misinformed. They have the wrong information in their head and are behaving out of ignorance. Also, people that they're missing critical information, which leads them to behave also out of ignorance. But we're talking about actual violent hatred, and the social media, I think, has allowed, and other medias around social media have allowed for the gamification of this violent hatred. And I think that at some level it becomes addictive. I think people become addicted to being angry. I think people become addicted to being hateful, and they become addicted to the attention they get when they say angry and hateful things. And I think it's that gamification of hatred which is particularly virulent and particularly of concern, because it does lead people down a rabbit hole. A question I've been asked a long time ago is, how did I lose my humanity? You seem like a nice guy. How did I lose my humanity? And I said, I didn't lose it. I traded it for acceptance and approval until there was nothing left. And nobody ends up, nobody starts off shooting people in the back in a mosque. It's an incremental slide down a hole until they become completely out of touch with, at that point, a lot of that is out of touch with reality, out of touch with their own humanity, and out of touch with the humanity of others in the process. And so I think we need to really worry about the gamification of this violent hatred.
And you brought up a great point. And with social media, and specifically social media platforms like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and Instagram. And these are the modern tools of communication, and the virtual world is now the real world in terms of communication, education, bias, and beliefs. Even beliefs, people's beliefs are being shaped by what they see online. And in the very rich research that the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism puts out, and I've read the reports that Heidi, your team, has put together, very powerful. But if you could talk about the role of these platforms and how these platforms are being used by these groups to recruit, to spread this disinformation and violent rhetoric and incitement to violence. And I think, again, a lot of meetings we have, a lot of people don't understand how pervasive, how prevalent, and how dangerous online hate is. Please add to the conversation about social media and its role as a weapon.
Okay, thanks, Tarek, and also thanks to all the organizers here. You know, I think Tony did a good job of explaining one of the ways that social media is weaponized. This gamification, I think, is right, especially with young people. That is a particularly pernicious way to walk someone down the path of radicalization, and something that just didn't exist, 20 years ago. I think the dark side of social media has done some terrible things to all of us. It has normalized hatred against various groups, Muslims, Jews, others, by making it appear when you're on Facebook or you're on Twitter as though these noxious ideas are normal because you're surrounded by hundreds of other people who are sharing those ideas. And if you were in a park in downtown Vancouver, you wouldn't be seeing that kind of warped view of the world. So that's one problem that we have. We've also seen the social media companies' systems, their algorithms, their ad systems, and so on, amplify hate content because they tend to spread polarizing content, which gets them clicks, gets people to view posts in a way that they don't push non-polarizing content. In other words, it's to their advantage, and this has been exposed repeatedly, to push the most angry, divisive material you can get. And then we have the issue that in the social media space, politicians who are willing to push extreme ideas, I'm thinking here of our former president in the United States and his attacks on immigrants and Muslims in particular, were given loopholes. In other words, the community standards that apply to all the rest of us didn't apply to exactly the people, political figures with large audiences, who have the ability to mobilize people into hate, which is a particularly egregious situation. And this isn't just something that's happening in the United States or in Canada. These problems are now being found worldwide. There are extremist political movements like Prime Minister Modi in India, who has risen to power along with his allies by demonizing the Muslim community. In Brazil, President Bolsonaro and his allies have been demonizing the LGBTQ community. In Germany, there's a party that runs entirely on anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant beliefs. All of these political figures with their large audiences are demonizing groups of people, communities of color predominantly, and using it to build a base and to teach supporters and potential supporters that it's completely normative and okay to say hateful things on a regular basis. So, Tony's right to think about the internet, or I think Mohammed talked about it a little earlier, as a zone of freedom. And it's impossible to imagine what our lives would have been like in the last year and a half without it. But at the same time, there has been a huge downside hitting largely marginalized and vulnerable communities in terms of violent hatred and even up to genocide. And we should remember this. The Rohingya genocide in Myanmar was orchestrated by military leaders of that state by using Facebook to demonize Muslims and to actually tell people who to attack and how to attack. And that's not the only place we've seen these things. So there's substantial real world violence coming off these platforms. And this is why something has to be done to rein the tech companies in, so that the good parts of the internet are allowed to flourish and the bad parts are stopped.
And in terms of solutions, Tony and Heidi, both of you have worked with the New Zealand government, and in the aftermath of the Christchurch shootings, where 51 people were killed in 2 mosques by somebody who was radicalized online. And as you mentioned, and I just wanted to illustrate one point, that lone actors, they're not lone actors if their community is online. So if it seems like one person was the shooter, but they have thousands of people that have been egging them on, that they've had online relationships and camaraderie, as Tony mentioned, when he was in this sphere, providing the community. So those virtual communities are influencing this. It's not lone individual actors. But just to go back to solutions and the Christchurch call, perhaps Tony, you could start about the Christchurch call, and then Heidi, you can add to it. Please go ahead, Tony.
The Christchurch call happened, I think it was in May of 2019, in the aftermath of what happened and the terrorist attack upon the 2 mosques in New Zealand, in a way to bring the Prime Minister of New Zealand government brought people together in Paris, about 40 people.
I usually have 2 cards, but
myself included, to discuss how do we tackle this, because there's no easy solution. There's no switch that we can hit to make it all go away. It's a very complex problem, and I believe it's going to take a whole of society solution to tackle this, and part of that solution is technological. There's no question. And as Vidya had said earlier, there's some platforms that, like 8chan, or some platforms are, you think they're a big platform, that's 2 guys in Poland, it's their side hustle. There's no way that they're going to mediate those. So we have to have a look at a technological solution. We also have to understand that technology is in itself part of the solution, and that technology can be harnessed, and social media can be harnessed to combat these ideas, to counter message, to provide a variety of responses. But there needs to be a responsible look at the platforms, and the platforms need to coordinate with each other. And some of that is already happening. I've spent time down at Facebook and with GIFCT and Tech Against Terror, and there's a whole lot of great technological minds looking to tackle this, but it's a lot more complex and a lot more difficult than it seems. But the Christchurch call, at least at the beginning, is about bringing together a unified solution so that this doesn't happen again in the future. And I'll let Heidi add her 2 cents, because she's very much involved with it as well.
Well, the solutions, first of all, I want to say Tony's right. This is a whole of society issue, right? So we're not just talking about what to do about the social media platforms or technology. And, Vidya mentioned some important things having to do with, literacy and fighting conspiracies. I mean, there's a lot of other things, education, that matter here to make people less susceptible to what's found online. But, at this point, most of the social media companies have decent or serviceable terms of service. The problem is that they're not applying them systematically and in the way that they're laid out. I just want to say YouTube, which is the platform that radicalized the Christchurch mosque shooter, is egregious in not following its rules. So there has to be a way to hold these companies to account. And what's interesting is that where that pressure is probably going to come from is from the European Union, that's looking at tighter regulations on this front, or from the United Kingdom, where there's an online harms bill being debated. It's most likely not going to happen in the United States because of the way the First Amendment works here. In fact, most of the changes in social media companies have come because of pressure of civil society in the United States and other places, not because of regulatory frameworks. So regulation is very, very important. Forcing the companies to apply their rules to all people matters deeply and would have a big suppressive effect on extremist movements like Modi's movement in India. That matters. On top of that, depending on which country you're talking about, there are hate speech efforts, bills, this is never going to happen in the United States because of the First Amendment, that will also have a suppressive effect. And if you have an effective law enforcement apparatus that will enforce hate speech penalties against material online, that can make a difference as well. Now, all of that said, we aren't going to ever be able to do anything about places like Telegram or 8kun. But by getting this stuff off of social media as much as possible and having them also make their artificial intelligence accountable for not spreading hate speech and bad ideas, we're going to cut off the sort of the biggest recruitment platforms, right? The places where most people are. Most people aren't on 4chan, 8kun, and whatnot. There's a lot of people there, but not the kind of widespread recruitment opportunities you have on the mainstream social media channels. So this is all about trying to deal with the companies supplying this hateful material. We still have issues of dealing with individual demand that's not just driven on getting sucked down rabbit holes or radicalized online. But those are all things that are going to be needed, tools that are going to be needed to be thrown at this really serious problem.
And at the moment, self-regulation, as you said, the social media companies are not following their own terms and conditions and their safety regulations. They're not following it in a systematic way. So in terms of Canada, the federal government and provincial governments regulating the online hate space, any recommendations based on what you would recommend for policymakers, government officials to consider? What are the lines between online hate, freedom of expression, which is the term in Canada rather than freedom of speech, and incitement to violence? So there's a lot of gray areas there. So maybe Tony or Heidi, whoever would like to start first, about what would recommendations be and how could it look like?
I'll just start with saying I think it's really important that we define it properly. I think because hate is, as one of the speakers earlier alluded to, we've almost become desensitized to it. And what does it actually mean? Is it someone who disagrees with us? Is that a hateful comment because I don't like it? I think we need to be very clear in our definitions if we're going to regulate it properly from a legislative perspective. I think the Supreme Court in Canada has allowed for restrictions to freedom of expression, and I can't remember the legislation, but so the mechanisms are there if we do it properly. But I think it's one of the key things is that we need to define exactly what it is. I think the definitions are hugely important.
Yeah, and I agree with Tony. I mean, you can't get at this problem without defining these things, and they are actually quite vague in many cases. There's the interesting situation in New Zealand right now where they're in the midst of accepting comments about possible strengthening to their hate speech law. And there's a lot of definitional debates about what applies and what doesn't. And so that's a key thing. I mean, my suggestion to the Canadian government would be to take a hard look at the German law, the British planned law, and the EU framework and try to figure out what pieces of that have been most successful and would be useful within the Canadian space. But I would also say, and I would say this to the US government as well, we need more data out of the companies. There's a lot that we don't know about what they're doing. how does your algorithm either increase polarization or reduce polarization? How much hate content you actually have online? What percentage do you really take down? Right now, we just have self-reporting from these companies. And what we really need is people who have the power of subpoena, at least in the American sense, I'm not sure what it is in Canada, to be able to really document what is happening inside these black boxes so that we can make policy decisions that make sense.
Absolutely. And now, as we are closing our panel, and we could keep talking because Heidi, you're an expert, Tony, you are an expert, and there's many aspects and nuance to this discussion. But in closing remarks in this panel, I'll start with Tony and then with Heidi as takeaways for the audience and the people that will be viewing this after this forum is over. So final takeaways, Tony.
Final takeaways, I think that there's something else that people should, I think, consider, because I think looking at this as a whole of society response, I think we should each look into our hearts and where are we judgmental? It may not be about race, it may not be about something, but you know, we can't be okay with dehumanization and judging people on one side and then over here not like it. I think we have to look at society as a whole and how do we get away from the increasing polarization and judgment of the other side that happens politically as well. Because if we get rid of all of the based on race, religion, and that type of thing, but we are a gaping wound of polarization on the political side, I don't know that we'll be in any better place.
Thank you.
I don't know if I can say much better than what Tony does. He always does it from such a much more heartfelt and less clinical position than where I am all the time. That, of course, thank you, Tony. That, of course, would be best. I mean, the other thing I would ask the audience here is to listen to the clips that I'm sure you all put up of the earlier speakers. I think sometimes we don't realize how much pain there is when you're subjected to these things. And we need to put ourselves in the shoes of other communities and people with different experiences. And I think when you do that, you know, it builds that empathy and makes you come to see the world from a better place. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you, Heidi. And for those that aren't aware, the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, a lot of very detailed research reports that I'd recommend everyone to read, and we will share those reports with those that request it. Then Tony, The Cure for Hate, to connect with Tony, and Tony does a lot of great work as well. So both of them, anyone who wants to connect with them, please let us know. Yusuf, please.
Thank you very much, Tark, and thank you, Tony and Heidi. Wow, what expertise and lived experience. I think this is something that it's very unique to understand both what it's like for a person who has been on the other side, as well as from someone who's dedicated their lives to understanding what it is. Part of what the intention here is for our legislators to hear this message and to have a more deep understanding of what the urgency is. Again, we've shown examples of how online hate is causing people's lives to be attacked, to be killed, and for their freedom of expression to be subverted, to be reduced. So Indigenous voices, Black voices, Muslim voices, LGBTQ voices, all either BIPOC or minority voices, or the voices we should be amplifying. White supremacist sound blips are just pressing it all down, in effect hurting that freedom of expression. Our next speaker is going to be talking to us from a bit of a legal perspective. What is hate crimes? What are online content hate crimes? What is their experience in Canada? Corporal Anthony Statham is a good friend of ours, and he has been a supporter of justice and the law here in British Columbia. He's with the BC RCMP Hate Crimes Division, and he's going to be sharing his presentation with us about this issue. And now, Anthony, please go ahead.
Thanks so much for having me. It's it's really humbling again to be asked to speak at this event and on behalf of the RCMP. I'm going to put up some slides on the screen here. It's just for the purpose of going over what the law in its current incarnation around hate crime is in Canada.
So you now have co-host authority. Anthony, please feel free to share your slides.
Thanks very much. This is going to be a very brief presentation, everyone. I'm going to start with the definition of hate crime, and it's an informal definition because, in fact, hate crime is that term is not defined in law in Canada. So the best description I can give you that sort of is a description of all of the various laws that we do have is that hate crime is a criminal offense that's committed against a person or property where the motivating factor is hate, prejudice, or bias against an identifiable group. So what's an identifiable group? It's actually defined in 3 different places in our criminal code, but the most complete definition right now is under section 718.2, which defines an identifiable group as any section of the public that's distinguished by race, national or ethnic origin, language, color, religion, sex, age, mental or physical disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity or expression, or on any other similar factor. The other similar factor component was added a few years ago by the federal government to describe groups that aren't yet specified in law. So there are 3 broad categories of hate crime in Canada. There are hate motivated crimes, which are dealt with under something called sentencing principles. There are hate propaganda crimes, and those include willful promotion of hatred, public incitement of hatred, and advocating genocide. And then we also have mischief to property that's religious or educational, or really any type of property that's used primarily by an identifiable group. So the first, my apologies. Just quickly on hate motivated crimes. I mean, those are overwhelmingly the types of, when we talk about hate crime in this country, hate motivated crimes are over 90% of what we're actually describing. Those range from more minor offenses like graffiti to very serious offenses up to and including murder. And the way that the law deals with hate motivated offenses is that all those offenses, whether it be an assault or criminal harassment or uttering threats or mischief, is dealt with the same that anything that isn't motivated by hate is investigated and dealt with in the courts. But then in the event that somebody is found guilty of an offense and convicted of that, the court then has the ability to consider hate as an aggravating factor to the offense and thereby impose an increased sentence. The slide I have up here describes willful promotion of hatred, and this is the offense that we are typically talking about when we use the term hate speech in Canada. And again, in Canada, we don't have anything regulating speech. Under Section 2 of our charter, we're protected, our freedom of expression is protected. So there's no such thing as free speech in Canada, only freedom of expression. And this section, willful promotion of hatred, is always balanced out against Section 2 of the charter, freedom of expression rights. And everyone who, by communicating statements other than in private conversation, willfully promotes hatred against an identifiable group. There's a proposed amendment to this section of the criminal code. It's quite recent, where the government's proposing to add a definition of hatred under this section of the code. Now, it may come as a surprise, to many Canadians, just in general, the fact that we have the section that deals with promoting hatred, but we haven't actually defined what hatred is. I think that the proposal to do that is a very good thing. It may not seem like a massive development in terms of, you know, dealing with the scope of everything that's been talked about here today. But it will equip law enforcement to see more things through to charges in this country, because I think that's part of it. And, you know, supporting victims and healing communities are, you know, probably the most critical pieces to any of this, but also law enforcement has to have the ability to use the law effectively. The constitutionality of this section of the criminal code was determined in 1990. And I think we can all agree that we've evolved quite a bit as a society since then. And this needs to be revisited, and an amendment to this section of the code, I believe, will have a positive effect as far as our ability to do something about online hate when something needs to be done. We also have public incitement of hatred under section 319, that should say 319.1 of the criminal code, not 319.2. But everyone who by communicating statements in any public place incites hatred against an identifiable group, where the incitement is likely to lead to a breach of the peace. You know, within the past 5 years in Canada, this section has actually been used in cases of online hate in Quebec and has been effective. I think that what we'll see is we'll continue to see this section litigated in certain cases too in the online context. We also have advocating genocide under section 318, which includes the definition of genocide, acts committed with the intent to destroy it in whole or in part any identifiable group, that is killing members of the group or deliberately inflicting conditions calculated to bring about its physical destruction. Again, this can be enforced in the online context. We do have a clear definition of what genocide is. And we've seen some cases recently in the past few years where we've had successful convictions in relation to this offense. And then finally, mischief to property. This doesn't apply necessarily to discussions around online hate, but essentially it's the other piece of law that we have in this country. So any premises or building that's primarily used by an identifiable group, the consideration for hate motivation is built into this piece of law. And so it's an automatic consideration every time. I'm just going to end with sort of an important question, very, very important right now. When is hate crime terrorism? And it's the answer to that at present, and it's going to continue to evolve, is that both hate crimes and terrorism can be committed for ideological reasons. And where significant violent attacks occur, both hate crime laws and terrorism laws may apply. And it's the requirement for the responsible law enforcement agencies to delegate investigation of any applicable criminal offenses. And if we think back to Quebec in 2017 and the questions from you know, the local Muslim community, and then literally Canadians across the country, and then people around the world, was, why has this suspect not been charged with terrorism? It has a terrorizing effect. Surely terrorism should be a consideration here. That suspect wasn't charged with terrorism. In the Christchurch attack, we saw a terrorism charge added to all the murder charges that the suspect there was convicted of. And what we've seen now in the recent attack in London is that a terrorism charge has been applied to that suspect. We're in an evolving state, I think, around legally, we're simply just litigating our terrorism legislation in cases where in the past it might have simply been regarded as a hate crime. Terrorism absolutely is relevant to events like that. It's also relevant to circumstances where there isn't a loss of life. And I think we're going to see that continue to evolve over the next over the years ahead of us, and that it's certainly going to be relevant to online forums as well. And I just want to end by saying that again, it's very, very humbling to be invited to speak at this event. And sort of it's interesting. This is just from a professional standpoint, listening to Heidi and Tony talk right before me. You know, the point that there'd be a lot of value for legislators in this country to look at laws in other countries, for example, Germany, where you have a law that criminalizes Holocaust denial. And in the German context, that makes absolute sense, given the history of that country. In Canada, Holocaust denial isn't criminalized. It would be protected as freedom of expression. I think that we can look at our own country and we can look at examples of how racialized and marginalized groups have been, you know, historically mistreated in this country, and where we have examples of genocide ourselves, and how those considerations are absolutely relevant to how our law needs to evolve. And on behalf of my peers in the RCMP, I'll simply say that we're absolutely committed to seeing justice done for everyone who needs it right now, and for those who didn't receive it in the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Again, we appreciate your allyship and your support, both from a law enforcement perspective as well as personally. What you shared here today, many Canadians are unaware of. And then what we always like to do is to showcase the issues that we're facing collectively, from a global level down to a national level, down to a municipal, provincial level, to show people how it all ties together. And what you shared was such an important part of that, because as Canadians, many folks are sometimes just familiar what they see on TV, which is usually just the American story, but there is a difference here, and that helps to inform how our legislation can look like. So again, thank you. It's so appreciated that you spent your time with us here today. And again, thank you very much, Anthony. Folks, now we are going to enter our last panel for the evening, which is going to be talking about something that's very important. How do we protect freedom of expression in online hate legislation? Our moderator for this panel is my friend Ryan Chan, the project lead with CCNCSJ, which is the Chinese National Council for Social Justice. Ryan is a social advocate who has a legal background from the University of Toronto. He's committed to affecting social change, but also by doing it, he serves on the board of directors with the Federation of Asian Canadian Lawyers and acts as a consultant for many NGOs. Ryan, I'll leave it to you to introduce the panel and take it from here.
Thank you so much, Yusuf. So it's my pleasure to introduce Evan Balgord, the Executive Director of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, and Dr. Richard Moon, of a professor of law at Windsor University. So Evan is an investigative journalist and researcher covering the rise of the new far right and hate groups in Canada. He's a fellow of the Monk School of Global Affairs Fellowship in Global Journalism, and graduated with an Honors Bachelor of Science from the University of Toronto. Dr. Richard Moon is a distinguished university professor and professor of law at the University of Windsor, and the recipient of many law school and university-wide teaching awards. His research focuses on freedom of expression and freedom of conscience and religion. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
So,
for my part, sorry, Ryan, just before we jump in, Richard, I just want to say, you know, I've seen you kind of in the chats in the various panels on subjects like this going back, and of course I've read your report on Section 13. I just wanted to say I've been very much looking forward to having a conversation with you and to see, where we can find some nuance and if your thinking's changed since, 2008 to 2021 on the subject. So just to say, I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, Richard, I believe you're muted.
I was going to say, thanks, Evan. I was going to say, I'm surprised we haven't actually met yet. It seems odd we move in these sort of worlds, but have not quite engaged before. So it's great to be here with you.
Yeah, and I'm certainly looking forward to this discussion. Part of the reason we have to have this conversation, I think, is because you can't have a discussion about, online hate and social media regulations without talking about freedom of speech, right? It's always a hot topic in all of our work, anti-racism work, regulatory work. At the end of the day, it is, to some extent at least, a political animal. And so, we want to get ahead of this discussion, and we want to have that free and open and frank discussion about, what does that really mean? What does online hate legislation have to do with free speech? And, that kind of leads to my first question. I want to be clear that this, I don't intend for this question for you to answer in any particular way. What I want to hear is, the different sides of the argument. So my question is protecting freedom of expression the antithesis to online hate legislation? So again, I really do want to hear your honest opinions. I'm not trying to, hook you into saying anything in particular. And, if whichever position you take, I'd like to know, if not, why not? And, if you think it is the antithesis, like where do you think the balance should be? So if one of you would like to jump in.
Sure. Well, I'll start. The argument today is, there's basically two main points we're kind of putting forward here. The first being that there's so much online hate right now, and it is so targeted, people feel so free to exercise it, that it is a minefield for like a woman, a person of color, an LGBTQ plus person to engage in our society, right? To have an opinion, to be political, to be a journalist, to enter politics. It's fraught. So, we have reports and studies and firsthand, testimonies from these individuals who say, we experience hate all the time. And for many of us, as we heard from some of the moonshot data also kind of demonstrate this, some of them feel the need to go and seek actual like mental health counseling as a result of the hate they see all the time. But for many people, it drives them out of places where they would exercise their freedom of expression, right? So we have female journalists who are choosing not to continue practicing journalism because they are getting, gendered rape threats towards them and their baby daughter, for example, and unfortunately that's not an isolated experience, and it's not uncommon. Just yesterday actually, we saw, a particularly awful kind of racist abuser guy that we keep tabs on. There was a woman who was going through a mental health crisis, and he was telling her that she should kill herself. And these are kind of the things that we see commonplace and every day. And I think that unfortunately, the goal of this is to shut up women and people of color and LGBTQ plus persons and drive them out of the public discourse. So I think the status quo right now is really bad for freedom of expression, right? And if we did our best to get the worst kind of forms of hate offline, are we curtailing some free expression? Yes, we are. We're curtailing the expression of, racist trolls and abusers in favor of the expression of, women, people of color, and members of like LGBTQ plus persons and so on and so forth. So I don't think that there is an ideal world where everybody can just have unlimited free speech and say what they want and it all just kind of shakes out. We kind of have to figure out how to forge a channel where we are going to kind of pick some winners and losers here, right? But the losers that, hopefully this legislation, we're going to prioritize women and people of color and LGBTQ plus persons over trolls. So I don't think that it's an antithesis to free expression, this kind of legislative push. I think it's ultimately going to promote it, but that's a hard argument for a lot of people to buy into. It's nuanced, and not everybody buys into the conceptualization of it. So I think it is antithesis to legislation where there's going to be a lot of criticism of any efforts to do anything in this field, even if it is well-reasoned. And I'm actually hopeful that's part what we can do here today, right? And Richard is find that nuanced way to, to approach it so that we can achieve kind of all of our aims.
Yeah, I mean, I agree substantially with that. Of course, we accept, and in fact, our constitutional right to freedom of expression has built into it the idea that there can be or should be limits sometimes on freedom of expression. The difficult question always is, well, why exactly limits and when are those limits appropriate? And that's the challenge. I mean, traditional ideas of free speech start off with the notion that a speaker is not responsible for the actions or the beliefs his or her audience may take on board as a consequence of the speech itself. In other words, we don't treat speech as a cause of subsequent action. That's the sort of underlying assumption. But we all know there are limits to that. And people will talk and give examples like you can't yell fire, falsely yell fire in a crowded theater, for example. So when we get to hate speech, the real question is, well, we're talking about extreme speech. We may not be willing to take the risk that the message behind this speech will in fact be taken up by some in the audience. And we're also aware that this speech occurs in a certain way and often in a certain context. It's often very visceral, it's angry, it's hateful. It plays to people's fears, their anxieties, their resentments. And it often occurs in a context where there isn't really any opportunity to dispute, refute what's said. It historically, at least, often took place at the margins of public discourse and was public, but only in a very limited sense. It was often semi-private in its character. And as a consequence, there was no real opportunity to engage with it. So I think there are lots of good reasons for recognizing that hate speech can and should be a restriction, a justified restriction on expression. And our courts have said so. They've upheld various forms of hate speech law in a variety of decisions over the previous decades.
So thank you. Richard, I was actually wondering, could you elaborate a little bit more? Like, do you think, like, for example, with the court's decisions, like, is that, would you think that that is like the baseline for where legislation should go, or should we be trying to push like past that?
Well, I mean, there are different ways we can mean by pushing past it. There's so many things that could be said here. I mean, whatever courts have said, and I think they're right on this, is that the law can, in a way that is compatible with a commitment to freedom of expression, can really only restrict extreme speech. And the courts talked about speech that involved the detestation, the vilification of members of a group. And I sometimes frame that as speech that if you were to take, if an audience member were to take its message seriously, were to take it on board, they would have to conclude that some kind of radical action against the members of a particular group was justified. That's how I often understand it. So I think that any restriction probably has to be confined to very extreme speech because of, let me put it this way, bigoted speech is widespread in our society. I mean, just think about stereotypes and how commonplace they are. The fact is that given how commonplace they are, it would be enormously difficult, impractical, in fact, troubling if the state were to try to intervene to expunge those from any kind of public space or public conversation. And given how widespread they are, I think it makes it even more vital that they be confronted, and we've got to think about how to confront or respond to them. But I want to add one more thing. Something was said about, obviously, social media and the way in which social media has enabled hateful views to spread more widely and really in many ways become part of the mainstream. And that's been really troubling. And I worry that hate speech law can be workable or effective in addressing hateful views that occur at the margins of public discourse, but can't really address or deal in an effective way or in a practical way when hate speech enters mainstream discourse. And I worry about the capacity of law to do that and the consequence of relying on law to do that.
Yeah, so I do actually, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think that perhaps we have, a difference in opinions between yourself and Evan. So, Richard, just to clarify, so you think that online hate legislation should be restricted to extreme speech, correct?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Okay, Evan, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would unpack it into kind of two different categories that might be helpful here. So we can discuss, the government looks like it's bringing back Section 13. So for the audience, we've kind of touched on Section 13. What happened, we used to have this Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act, and the very short and easy version of it is you could go and make a complaint to the Canadian Human Rights Commission that somebody was using speech that could open up a group to harm. It was vilifying them. It was hateful. And the commission would, hear those complaints, and if they were warranted, they would elevate them to the tribunal, and there'd be a hearing, and then the tribunal could order that person stopped, essentially. It was repealed a number of years ago, even though the Supreme Court found it to be constitutional. So the government is looking at bringing Section 13 back. So here it might be useful to kind of draw kind of two boundary lines and kind of talk about, or break this into two separate topics. Maybe we can talk about Section 13, where we're talking about, let's call it the pointier end of like the legal spectrum, right? We're talking about consequences ordered by a court. And then kind of the other thing that's happening, and it's kind of two prongs of a spear here, is that the government's considering legislation that would introduce regulations on social media companies for content, let's say, is extreme, but perhaps not to the level of extremity of things that we'd be considering under Section 13. So maybe it'd be helpful if we actually broke those two things out. I very much support the reinstatement of Section 13. And I noticed that, some of the recommendations that you had, Richard, around the time when you said it should either be repealed or it should be kind of clarified with a few things. Some of the clarifications you'd asked for looks like they are coming. So I'm wondering what are your thoughts on like the reinstating of Section 13?
Yeah, I realize we're kind of out of time here. So these are large questions. I mean, my concerns about Section 13, years ago, and of course, it's important to remember that Section 13 and the report I wrote was in a very different context, where hate speech was not, well, social media had very limited presence at that point, and hate speech was really occurring in marginal websites of different kinds. But my principal concerns were the burden it placed upon private citizens to make complaints and to carry that complaint through a process. And I don't think that's different. I think that's still a problem. And I think it's not accidental that there were very few complaints made under the previous Section 13 and even fewer that went through the process. I see, Ryan, are you about to tell me I need to stop?
Oh, no, sorry, my cat is
okay.
She shouldn't be.
you had that look about you. I mean, the other concern I had really is that the whole structure and organization of human rights legislation, for reasons I won't even try to set out here, is not well suited to addressing hate speech, because under human rights laws, discrimination is understood very broadly. And as the courts have said, human rights laws are primarily to be viewed as concerned with education, with conciliation between parties. That really is not how we understand hate speech. Hate speech is extreme, and how it needs to be addressed is perhaps not ordinarily through conciliation, at least through a process of getting the parties, the neo-Nazi, together with the victim of his or her speech, for example. And so there's just a whole range of issues, and I'm not sure they're entirely addressed by the changes here, and quite the contrary, maybe there are many other problems. But I actually think this legislation is probably next to useless anyway. The world has changed so much. The idea that you could address the massive problem of online hate speech through a private complaint system that involves a commission that will then investigate and determine whether that complaint should be then sent for adjudication to a tribunal seems entirely impractical in this new world. Any meaningful response to the problem, it seems to me, has to involve legislation that brings social media into the issue. And I know the government has been talking about this, it's been considering it. There are also huge problems with such a system. And I suspect that's exactly why the government has put forward this revised Section 13, has talked over and over again about how they were going to bring forward legislation that required social media to take down hate speech through some complaint system, but we never see it. And there's a discussion paper, we haven't yet seen it. I think because there are enormous problems in trying to reconcile this requirement that social media take this down with a commitment to free speech and the concern that social media not remove too much speech that might not be considered hate speech in order to simply protect themselves. And of course, there's the very practical problem that there is so much stuff out there. How do you develop a mechanism that takes down hate speech, but not other stuff? And that's a real problem. And I don't have any clear answers to that.
Well, I mean, one of the solutions we're kind of conceptualizing right now that I'd like to throw back. The idea being when it comes to, Section 13 and the new provision in Section 319, subsection 2. That's meant for like the worst of the worst that can't be dealt with any other way, right? And I hope it is truly used for that. I hope it isn't used overly leniently because it is meant to be used for the worst of the worst. When it comes to the online harms legislation, the government requiring hateful content to come down, kind of one theme that was evident in your paper had to deal with the idea of violence. So it was my hope that we'd start with a definition that said, material that promotes or glorifies or celebrates the violence towards a protected group, Facebook or Twitter or whatever would have to remove it, right? And that if they were caught not removing it, they pay a fine. And that there could be like this independent regulator that, could be open and transparent with the public and could kind of update things so that, hate groups they can't just keep using a different slur for a racial group and like making up new language, but there's like an advisory body to stay on top of that, right? That's kind of the hope here. And in terms of like the concern about removing speech over broadly, the hope was that there would be, at least on our part, a meaningful appeals process, but for the first time, it would kind of be a different onus, right? So right now we have victims have to self-represent, and that's really difficult for them. They can go to Facebook and say, they'll report something to Facebook and Facebook just won't take it down. They'll click the appeal button and Facebook still just will leave up clearly hateful content. They'll send us examples of it and we'll look at it and be like, yeah, that's really obviously and very pointedly racist. And it's against their terms. And why are they keeping it up? We know that Facebook's actually good at removing certain types of content. I mean, there's no child pornography on Facebook, basically. There's no like murder videos or cartel murder videos, or they're pretty good at taking those down too. They're pretty good at removing some kind of stuff. So the idea being that there'd be a requirement, and if somebody's stuff was taken down and it felt like it was in error, let's say somebody's being very critical of immigration or something, right? And somehow it flagged tripped the censor that, the system thought it was racist. We'd hope that there'd be like a meaningful appeals process, but, it would be, yes, somebody would have to advocate to have their content put back up. It's a radical flipping on its head of the concept, rather than the victim advocating, it would be the person who might have tripped the censor because Facebook thinks it's abusive. So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on kind of that flipping of the script?
Yeah, so I also do want to be conscious of time. I do apologize. I know we've gone over. I guess I'll just quickly frame the issue and perhaps we'll get like a last note from everyone. So I guess essentially the issue is, we've heard some very differing opinions on like what exactly online hate legislation should target, whether it needs to go further than just extremist content, or whether it really needs to be prioritizing certain marginalized groups, freedoms of speech. So in terms of like what can be used outside of just legislation to bolster that, Evan's mentioned, an alternative regulatory body, a reverse onus appeal system. Professor Moon, do you have, any thoughts on how, the issue can actually be tackled?
Oh, I'm too old to have, incredible knowledge and grasp of, social media and its workings, but I would love to think that's possible. And, Evan mentioned the idea of reversing onus. I mean, I do think we have to rethink many of our assumptions about free speech, or freedom of expression. I use the terms interchangeably, unlike some people. I do think we need to rethink some of these in light of the way in which social media platforms are, privately owned, but important public forums, and in which there is such a flood of misinformation, of hateful speech, and so forth. So the idea of reversing the onus or flipping things is not so troubling to me. When we talk about free speech, we used to talk about censorship as the principal concern, and we should focus on state censorship. But I think now we need to think about misinformation and the flood of such speech as maybe the greatest threat to our public discourse, even more than censorship now. So I hope Evan is right that there is a workable procedure to address this in a way that reconciles our commitment to freedom of expression with removing so much of this odious, hateful stuff. I'm skeptical because there is so much of it, and I worry that any process will either come across as highly selective, focusing on some problems rather than others, or will just break down under the weight of the problem.
Evan, any last comments?
No, I mean, I think I share Richard's concerns there. I look forward very much, the government is expected to put out its technical paper on what it's thinking about this legislation on online harms. And, I expect, we're going to run into each other on panels and kind of discuss it when we have some of those details. And I look forward to that. That's kind of where we stand. I mean, for the general audience, we've got this legislation is coming. It's written. The government's going to do a consultation process on it over the summer, where folks like myself and Richard and Ryan and many others are going to start arguing over the details on it and trying to find that correct balance of, removing hate speech without, going too far, both because, it becomes politically untenable and, we won't get the legislation if it goes too far, and because it's not good for it to go too far in the first place. So, I mean, I guess all I can say is, stay tuned. And, we've heard today how important it is for people who are harmed by this to get it done. And hopefully we can all be part of the conversation, figuring out how to do it in the most reasonable and effective way possible. So thank you again.
Thank you, both of you. And, I'm just going to do a quick plug, for our own work at CCNCSJ. We like to think that we, Richard, like you said, the solutions are complicated. There's so much out there. Hopefully there are some third-party solutions, and we like to think that we have, or we're in the process of developing one of them. Essentially, we're using our own artificial intelligence algorithms to do research on and hopefully counteract ultimately the spread of online hate on disinformation and misinformation through the use of automated processes to detect and report for removal that kind of hate. So, hopefully that kind of solution is, compatible with what you have in mind, and that we can continue to have this conversation. You just muted there.
Thanks so much for including me in this, and lovely to meet everybody.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan, for hosting the panel. Dr. Moon, Evan, thank you very much, gentlemen, for sharing the vision and the different perspectives. We're all on the same team. We just maybe the dialogue that we're having here today can perhaps inform some of our legislators, which is a nice segue into our closing speaker, who is MLA Rachna Singh. We're honored to have you here, Rachna. She is the Parliamentary Secretary for Anti-Racism Initiatives in the province of British Columbia. She was elected as an MLA for Surrey Green Timbers in May of 2017 and was re-elected in October 2020. Rachna originally moved from India to Canada, coming up on, I think, maybe the 20-year anniversary. And she chose Surrey to build a better life for her family. Lots of social work. She's worked as a drug and alcohol counselor, support worker for women facing domestic violence, community activist. So she has a broad perspective of these issues and the impact on communities. So please, Rachna, as our closing speaker.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brother Yusuf. And as you have introduced, I'm Rachna Singh, BC's Parliamentary Secretary for Anti-Racism Initiatives. And I'm grateful to be speaking to you from the shared traditional territories of the Semiahmoo, Katzie, Kwikwetlem, Kwantlen, Tikait, and Swasan First Nations. And before I begin, I want to thank the organizers for creating a space for this important dialogue. I'm really sorry I could not join before and here to the conversation. I think it is very, very important conversations that we were doing here today. Online hate is not an easy topic to grapple with, but we must tackle it head on. And it is one of the #1 issues in our country. 4 years ago in Quebec City, 6 people were murdered and many more injured in a place of safety and worship. The lives of their families, friends, and communities changed forever. Our country was changed too. A holy place was violated. This was an attack that not only devastated this country, but shook communities across the world. I remember how I felt hearing the news. The shock of knowing that a man walked into a sacred space and opened fire on other people just because of their beliefs and the color of their skin. And then we felt the pain all over again with the recent attack in London, Ontario. The Afzal family looks like a lot of our families. When I saw their family photo, 1,000 emotions ran through me. I'm still at loss of words for it. These acts of terrorism showed us what happens when we let anti-Muslim hate thrive online and in our institutions. We must reaffirm our commitment to stand against racism, violence, and discrimination. It is this commitment that is driving my work as BC's Parliamentary Secretary for Anti-Racism Initiatives. In this role, I will lead the work on introducing BC's first Anti-Racism Act and a better approach to data collection to ensure that we are supporting all British Columbians in a way that is fair and equitable, regardless of our race, faith, or skin color. While these are decisions made by our government, it is important to recognize the years of advocacy and grassroots organizing that has led us to this point. I look forward to the recommendations for today's conversations. Your work and time help guide our approaches to anti-racism legislation, especially our Anti-Racism Act. As we begin our anti-racism public consultations next month, I look forward to connect with the community. At a time when Islamophobia, hate, and bigotry are ever present here at home and around the world, it takes all our voices to challenge racist acts, condemn hate speech, and stand up for more equitable society. Now is the time to come together to build a stronger province and stronger communities. Today and every day, we stand with the Muslim community and pledge to continue the fight against hate, bigotry, and Islamophobia. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rachna. And again, much appreciated joining. Folks, that brings us to the end of today's forum. This national forum talked about the personal experiences of people who are dealing with online hate. We talked about how white supremacist ideology, as well as other hate ideologies, are spreading on online hate and how it's being utilized as a weapon. And we also talked about how we're going to protect our freedom of expression, which is such a cherished right in Canada in terms of the new legislation that we need to protect us from the changing environment. I want to thank all our speakers, our supporters, our participants, Jagmeet Singh, who sent a wonderful video which started our event. MLA Rachna Singh, thank you very much for closing the event. Evan Balgord, he's the executive director of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. And it was actually Evan, he's the person who had the vision and impetus for this forum, which brought us all here together to support the legislation. Ryan Chan, CCNCSJ, thank you so much for co-hosting and organizing as well as Rachel Mansell, Vice President of the MOSAIC Institute, Mohammed Hashem, Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Federation and a great supporter, as well as Isa Klix. So thank you very much for sharing your voice and truth with us, as well as Naima Ali. Again, these are the stories that are shared by millions of people, and it's important for us to amplify their voices. I want to thank my colleague and fellow moderator, Tarek Tayeb, Foundation for Path Forward, as well as Islam Unraveled Anti-Racism Initiative, Dr. Heidi Bayrich, co-founder of the Global Project Against Violent Hate and Extremism, Vidya Ramalingan, founder of Moonshot, Tony Mcaleer, and founder of Cure for Hate and a former neo-Nazi, Corporal Anthony Statham, from the RCMP Hate Crimes, as well as Dr. Richard Moon, Professor at Law at Windsor University. All of the voices that we heard here today, we'll be sharing this message with the government. We'll be sharing it on social media. We'll be sharing it with those who need to hear it, both the full message as well as everyone's clips, so that each component can have its due. Again, appreciating everyone who joined us today. Please, amplify each other's voices, support each other in allyship, and together we can address this existential issue and solve it. Thank you so much. Have a beautiful evening.